My name is Emily Wright. I'm 32 years old. And last month, I sat in that courtroom watching my father demand every last piece of my mother's estate, while the judge, his old college friend, smirked at me like I was nothing more than a naive child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. I thought I'd lost everything. Everything she worked for, everything she saved, everything she loved. Until I whispered 3 words that made the judge's face drain of all color, and in that deafening silence that followed, I realized my mother had been preparing me for this moment my entire life. Before I tell you how everything changed that day, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened next will shake you to your core. You have to understand, I'm nobody special. I teach 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary. I drive a 10-year-old Honda with a crack in the windshield that I can't afford to fix. I clip coupons and buy generic cereal because that's what my budget allows. I'm not powerful. I'm not connected. I'm just a woman who lost her mother 6 months ago and has been drowning in grief ever since. But my father? Leonard Wright is everything I'm not. He's a partner at Wright, Davidson Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. He drives a Mercedes that costs more than I make in 2 years. He owns 3 houses and a yacht he named Justice Served, because apparently even his boat has to mock the very concept of fairness. When my parents divorced 15 years ago, he took everything. The house where I learned to ride a bike, the cabin where we spent summers roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories, even my mother's grandmother's china, pieces that had been in our family for 4 generations. He claimed he needed liquid assets for his expanding practice. My mother, broken and exhausted from fighting him, signed it all away just to be free of his manipulation. All she kept was a small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street and her collection of books, photographs, and the few pieces of jewelry her mother had left her. Simple things. Things with memories attached, not dollar signs. Things that mattered to her heart, not her bank account. But apparently, even that was too much for Leonard Wright to leave alone. When the cancer took her in March, I thought the nightmare was over. I thought I could grieve in peace, could sit in her kitchen and remember the way she hummed while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. I thought I could keep the house where she died, where her spirit still lingers in every corner, where I can still smell her lavender perfume when the wind blows just right through her bedroom window. I was so incredibly naive. 3 days after the funeral, 3 days, when I could barely function, when I was still finding her reading glasses in random places and breaking down every time I opened a closet and saw her clothes, his attorney sent me papers. He was contesting the will. He claimed my mother wasn't of sound mind when she wrote it. He said she'd been manipulated by me, that I'd poisoned her against him during her final months. The lies burned in my throat like acid. My mother was sharper at 72 than most people half her age. She balanced her own checkbook, did the New York Times crossword in pen, and could recall conversations from 30 years ago, word for word. But more than that, she spent her final months protecting me, not the other way around. She made me promise I'd be strong enough to stand up to him if he ever came for what little she had left. "Promise me, Emmy," she whispered from that hospital bed. Her hand so thin I was afraid I'd break it just by holding it. "One day, if he ever tries to take what's mine again, don't let him. You're stronger than you know." I promised her. God help me. I promised her with tears streaming down my face. And now here I was, about to break that promise because I didn't know how to fight a man who'd spent 40 years learning every dirty trick in the book. Please subscribe and comment where you're from if this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me. Because the courtroom that day, it was like walking into a rigged casino where the house always wins, and they're not even pretending to hide it. Judge Harrison sat behind that bench like he owned the world, and maybe he did. He and my father had been college roommates, fraternity brothers, golf partners for decades. They shared inside jokes and knowing glances while my court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking woman who seemed like she'd rather be anywhere else, shuffled through papers with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. Every time my attorney tried to speak, Judge Harrison would interrupt her. "Ms. Chen, please stick to the relevant facts." But when my father's high-priced lawyer opened his mouth, suddenly the judge had all the time in the world. "Please continue, Mr. Davidson. Take all the time you need." The bias was so obvious it was suffocating. When my attorney presented evidence of my mother's mental competency, medical records, witness statements, documentation that she'd been coherent and decisive right up until her death, Judge Harrison barely glanced at it. "I'll take this under advisement," he said, the same way you'd dismiss a child asking for a later bedtime. But when my father's team presented their so-called evidence, a single doctor's note from 2 years ago, mentioning that grief over her sister's death had left her temporarily emotional, suddenly, that was the most important document in the room. "This is very concerning," the judge said, stroking his chin like he was Solomon contemplating the wisdom of the ages. I watched my father during all this, sitting there in his $1,000 suit, completely relaxed. He'd lean back in his chair, occasionally whisper something to his attorney that made them both chuckle quietly. He never looked at me, not once. I was invisible to him, which somehow hurt worse than if he'd glared at me with hatred. At least hatred would have acknowledged I existed. The worst part was how they talked about my mother, like she was a confused old woman who'd been tricked by her manipulative daughter. They painted me as some kind of scheming gold digger who'd isolated her from her loving ex-husband, the same loving ex-husband who hadn't spoken to her in 5 years except through lawyers. "Your Honor," my father's attorney said in that smooth, practiced voice, "it's clear that Ms. Wright took advantage of her mother's vulnerable emotional state. The defendant systematically alienated Mrs. Wright from her family." Family? What family? My father? Who never called, never visited, never sent so much as a birthday card? And manipulated her into believing false narratives about their marriage. False narratives. That's what they called the bruises I helped her cover with makeup. That's what they called the nights she cried herself to sleep after he'd torn her down with his words. False narratives. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and list every cruel thing he'd ever said to her. Every time he'd made her feel small and worthless. Every promise he'd broken. But every time I shifted in my seat, my attorney would put a warning hand on my arm. "Don't give them ammunition," she'd whisper. "Stay calm. Stay calm while they desecrated my mother's memory. Stay calm while they rewrote history to make the victim into the villain. Stay calm while this corrupt judge nodded along like everything they said made perfect sense." Hours passed like this. Motion after motion denied. Evidence dismissed. Witnesses deemed irrelevant. I watched my case crumble piece by piece while my father's grew stronger with every ruling. By noon, I could see it in my attorney's eyes. We were losing. Badly. During the lunch recess, Ms. Chen pulled me aside in the hallway. "Emily, I have to be honest with you. This isn't going well. Judge Harrison he's not being impartial here. I think we need to consider settling." Settling. Giving him everything. Letting him win again. "What would that mean?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would destroy me. "You'd keep some of the personal items, photos, maybe some jewelry. But the house, the savings account, the life insurance, Emily, I think you need to prepare yourself." I couldn't breathe. The hallway started spinning, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. All those nights I'd spent in that house after Mom died, curled up in her bed because it still smelled like her. All those mornings I'd made coffee in her kitchen and imagined her voice telling me everything would be okay. Gone. All of it gone to a man who'd already taken everything once and apparently decided that wasn't enough. That's when the rage hit me. Not the hot, explosive kind that makes you say things you regret. The cold, focused kind that clarifies everything. I thought about my mother's promise, about the strength she said I had. I thought about every woman who'd ever been silenced by powerful men, every daughter who'd watched her mother's legacy get stolen by someone who never deserved it in the first place. Please subscribe and let me know where you're watching from, because what I did next changed everything. When court resumed, the performance continued. More motions denied, more evidence dismissed. Judge Harrison barely bothered to hide his bias anymore. He'd interrupt my attorney mid-sentence, but give my father's team unlimited time to present their arguments. At one point, he actually yawned while Ms. Chen was reading a statement from one of my mother's friends about her mental state in her final weeks. My father was practically glowing. He'd started smiling openly now, confident in his victory. When his attorney made a particularly vicious comment about my mother's obvious decline in judgment, my father actually chuckled out loud. The sound cut through me like a blade. That's when I'd had enough. I stood up. The entire courtroom went quiet, and Judge Harrison looked at me with annoyed surprise. "Ms. Wright, please sit down. You're not—" "Your Honor," I said, my voice stronger than I expected it to be. "I've sat here for 6 hours listening to my mother's character being assassinated by people who barely knew her. I've watched you dismiss evidence without reading it, deny motions without consideration, and show favoritism so obvious that everyone in this room can see it." The judge's face went red. "Ms. Wright, you are out of order. Sit down immediately, or I'll hold you in contempt." "Contempt?" The word came out like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I'm already being held in contempt. By you. By this entire process. By a system that lets powerful men rewrite history, while their victims can't even speak." My attorney was tugging at my sleeve, whispering urgently for me to sit down, but I couldn't stop. 15 years of watching my mother struggle. 6 months of grief. 6 hours of this farce. It all came pouring out. "This woman you're calling confused and manipulated? She raised me by herself after her husband abandoned us. She worked 2 jobs to put food on the table after he took everything in the divorce. She fought cancer for 8 months with more dignity and strength than any person should have to show. And now you want to hand over her final wishes to the same man who spent 25 years making her life miserable?" The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Harrison's face had gone from red to pale, but I wasn't finished. She knew this would happen. She knew he'd come for whatever scraps he'd left her the first time. She knew because she'd seen it before. The way powerful men take everything and then convince everyone it was justified. She knew, and she prepared me for this moment. I could see my father's smugness starting to crack. His attorney was whispering something urgent in his ear, but he wasn't listening. For the first time all day, he was actually looking at me, and there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. Judge Harrison tried to regain control. "Ms. Wright, you will sit down this instant or what?" I interrupted. "You'll find me in contempt? You'll dismiss my case? Your Honor, you've already decided to give my father everything he wants. What exactly do I have to lose by telling the truth?" The judge opened his mouth to respond, probably to threaten me with jail time or fines, but that's when I leaned forward, looked him directly in the eyes, and whispered 3 words that changed everything. Operation Golden Eagle. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. All the color drained from Judge Harrison's face like someone had opened a valve. His mouth fell open, and for several seconds, he just stared at me in complete shock. The confident, dismissive authority he'd worn all day crumbled away, leaving behind something that looked almost like fear. My father's reaction was even more dramatic. He went rigid in his chair, his eyes wide with what I can only describe as pure terror. The smug smile vanished completely, replaced by the kind of expression you see on someone who's just realized they're standing in quicksand. The entire courtroom felt the shift. Attorneys stopped shuffling papers. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keyboard. Even the security guard by the door straightened up, sensing something significant had just happened without understanding what. Judge Harrison tried to speak, but only managed to make a strangled sound. He cleared his throat, tried again. I'm calling a brief recess." His voice cracked on the last word. "Your Honor," my father's attorney said, clearly confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. 15 minutes, the judge managed, his eyes never leaving mine. "Everyone out. I need chambers. Now. Please subscribe and comment your location, because what happened next proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the truth that powerful people thought they'd buried forever." As the courtroom emptied, I sat there trying to process what had just occurred. I knew those words would have an impact. My mother had promised they would. But I hadn't expected such a complete transformation. Judge Harrison looked like he'd seen a ghost, and my father looked like he was about to be sick. Ms. Chen grabbed my arm as soon as we were in the hallway. "Emily, what just happened in there?" "What did you say to them?" I couldn't answer her. Not yet. Because I was thinking about the night before the hearing, about the discovery that had given me those 3 words in the first place. I'd been packing up Mom's bedroom, finally ready to go through her jewelry box, a simple wooden thing with a ballerina that used to spin when I was little, but had long since broken. I was expecting to find her wedding ring, maybe some earrings, the pearl necklace my grandmother had given her. Instead, at the very bottom, hidden under the velvet lining, I found a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my mother's careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines. Emmy, if you're reading this, then he's trying to take what's left. If you're ever in real danger, if the system fails you the way it failed me, say these words to Harrison, Operation Golden Eagle. He'll remember why he owes me everything. He'll remember what I never told anyone, not even you. Use it only if you have to. Use it only if there's no other way. Love, Mom. Below that, in her neat script, were those 3 words that had just turned my father's world upside down. I'd spent the whole night trying to figure out what they meant. Operation Golden Eagle. It sounded military, maybe governmental. I'd searched online but found nothing that seemed connected to my mother, my father, or Judge Harrison. Whatever it was buried deep, hidden from public record. But sitting in that hallway, watching my father pace like a caged animal while his attorney tried to get answers he clearly didn't have, I understood something crucial. My mother hadn't just been a victim. She'd been a guardian of secrets, a keeper of truths that powerful men thought they'd erased. 30 minutes passed instead of 15, then 45. My father kept checking his watch and whispering urgently into his phone. Judge Harrison's clerk came out twice to tell us it would be just a few more minutes. The second time, she looked nervous, like she'd never seen her boss in whatever state he was currently in. Finally, we were called back in. Judge Harrison looked like he'd aged 10 years in less than an hour. His hands were shaking slightly as he shuffled papers, and when he spoke, his voice had lost all its earlier authority. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, he began, not looking at anyone, this court finds that the deceased, Margaret Wright, was of sound mind and body when she executed her final will and testament. My father shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is... Sit down, Mr. Wright. The judge's voice was quiet, but carried an edge of steel that made my father comply immediately. This court further finds that the evidence presented by the plaintiff regarding Mrs. Wright's alleged mental incompetence is insufficient, and frankly, insulting to the memory of a woman who demonstrated remarkable clarity of purpose until her death. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the same judge who'd spent all morning dismissing every piece of evidence in my favor, who'd treated my mother's memory like a joke. Motion to contest the will is denied. All assets remain under the control of Emily Wright as specified in her mother's testament. He paused, finally looking directly at my father. Furthermore, Mr. Wright, any future attempts to relitigate this matter will be viewed as harassment of the bereaved and may result in sanctions. The gavel came down with finality. It was over. I'd won. But the strangest part was that I didn't feel victorious. I felt something deeper, more complex. I felt like I finally understood my mother in a way I never had before. She hadn't been the helpless victim I'd always seen. She'd been playing a longer game, protecting secrets that gave her power even from beyond the grave. My father left without looking at me, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Judge Harrison disappeared into his chambers immediately after adjourning, avoiding any eye contact. Even his clerk seemed eager to get away from whatever dark energy had settled over that courtroom. But I stayed. I sat in that empty courtroom for almost an hour, thinking about strength and power and the difference between them. I'd always thought my father was strong because he could intimidate people, because he had money and connections and influence. I'd thought I was weak because I had none of those things. Now I understood that real strength looks different. It looks like a dying woman making sure her daughter has the tools she'll need to fight back. It looks like keeping secrets for decades, not out of fear, but out of strategy. It looks like trusting that justice delayed doesn't always mean justice denied. I never found out exactly what Operation Golden Eagle was. My mother took that secret with her, and honestly, I think that's how it should be. Some truths are too dangerous for daylight, too powerful for ordinary conversation. All I know is that it connected my mother to something Judge Harrison and my father desperately wanted to stay buried. And that connection was enough to tip the scales of justice back where they belonged. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt my mother's presence stronger than I had since the day she died. Not the sick, diminished woman from her final months, but the fierce protector who'd raised me, who'd sacrificed everything to give me a better life, who'd spent her last years making sure I'd be strong enough to stand up for myself when the time came. That evening, I sat in her kitchen, my kitchen now, and made myself a cup of tea the way she'd taught me, strong enough to wake the dead, sweet enough to make life bearable. I thought about all the women who'd been silenced by powerful men, all the daughters who'd watched their mothers' legacies get stolen by people who never deserved them. I thought about the letters I'd write, the stories I'd tell, the ways I'd honor not just my mother's memory, but her strategy. She'd taught me that sometimes you have to be patient, that sometimes you have to let your enemies think they've won while you prepare for the real battle. She'd taught me that 3 words can change everything, but only if you save them for the moment when they'll matter most. If this story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And remember, you're stronger than you know. Sometimes strength looks like silence and patience and the truth that powerful people thought they'd buried forever. Sometimes it looks like a mother's love that reaches beyond the grave to protect the daughter she raised to be unbreakable.